Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 2, Conflicts and Challenges in Canada, 1800 to 1850. This is Lesson Number 15, What Was Life Like for Aboriginal People? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. With all of the Loyalists settling in British North America, how do you think life changed for the First Nations? So, as always, I want you to put the video on pause so that you can consider this question and write down your response, and then we'll talk about this question in tomorrow's class. All right, let's proceed. In the early 1800s, more and more native peoples were being displaced from their homelands, and their cultures were under threat. Some First Nations peoples were displaced from the U.S. to the Canadas. For example, at the end of the American Revolution, the British government gave reserve land to native peoples who lost their land during the Revolution. And this image on the left shows representatives of the British government negotiating one of several land treaties with a First Nations tribe. When the Loyalists arrived, other First Nations were displaced within the Canadas. The British government made land treaties with the First Nations. In some cases, native tribes thought that they were renting out the land, and they did not realize that their land had been taken away through unfair land transfers. In 2010, the Canadian government recognized the unfairness of a land treaty it signed with the Mississauga First Nation and paid a land settlement of $145 million. And sad truth is that there are still many other unfair treaties which need to be addressed, and further land settlement agreements which need to be worked out between the Canadian government and First Nations today. Moving into settled communities made it very difficult for First Nations peoples to live their traditional lifestyles. Hunting, trapping, and fishing were more difficult because these communities were far away from the best hunting grounds and fishing holes. Native peoples tried other ways to make a living. Some found work in towns, while others focused on selling goods such as wild rice or maple sugar. It's just something I want you to think about. I'll talk about this tomorrow. Based on what you see in this painting, what steps are involved in making maple sugar? You might well put the video on pause just so you can get a closer look and jot down your ideas. All right, let's move on. Contact between two different groups can lead to cultural change. In Canada today, we benefit from sharing and celebrating a variety of different cultures. Cultural loss can happen, though, when one group loses aspects of its culture and embraces another group's culture. This is known as assimilation. While the British valued their strong military alliances with some First Nations, the British wanted native peoples to learn to speak English and become Christians. Native peoples were constantly being encouraged to adopt a European way of life. And here's yet another question for you to consider. Looking at this image on the left, how did the clothes being worn by the First Nations people in this painting show that the British are trying to assimilate them? Put the video on pause so you can take a closer look, jot down some ideas, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. Okay, moving on. While some First Nations were assimilated or learned to coexist with the Loyalists, the Beothuk of Newfoundland did neither. The Beothuk greatly valued their independence and traditions, and they were angered when Europeans started coming to Newfoundland to fish in 1600. The Beothuk and the fishers did not get along, and while there was some fur trading between the two groups, the fishers got angry when the Beothuk took items that the European fishing crews left behind in winter. Violence broke out, and the Beothuk fled to the interior of Newfoundland, where they starved due to not having access to food resources on the coast. The last surviving Beothuk died in 1829. And these drawings were left by uh, Shaunadithit, the last of the Beothuk people. Something I want you to think about is, what do you think she is trying to tell us in these drawings? So put the video on pause, take a longer look at her drawings, and we'll talk about them tomorrow. And let's continue. Although the early 1800s brought changes that created many hardships for many First Nations, a new Aboriginal culture was flourishing in Western Canada. The Métis are an Aboriginal people who have mixed European and First Nations ancestry. The first Métis were born to Canadiens, or Scottish, fur traders and native women. Many Métis children grew up to become fur traders like their fathers. While the first Métis were born in the 1600s, it was not until the 1800s that Métis people formed their own communities. They formed separate communities because they felt they were neither European nor native. Instead, they felt like a new people. Their communities were located near lakes and rivers near major trade routes. The Métis farmed the land in long, narrow strips along the river, much like the Canadiens did in Lower Canada. Most Métis worked part of the year in the fur trade, primarily for the Scottish-founded Northwest Company, or NWC for short. Some Métis worked as voyageurs, transporting furs and supplies for the NWC. They acted as navigators and translators for the Scottish employers. Others made a living by supplying trading posts with fish, meat, and equipment, such as snowshoes. And just take a look at this image on the left. This is the flag flown by Métis who worked for the Northwest Company. Those Métis who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company flew a similar flag. There was the same logo on the front, but the background was a solid red. An important source of income was the annual bison hunt. This hunt provided Métis families with food, as well as a means of making money by selling extra bison meat. Pemmican is dried bison meat that is treated with animal fat and berries. Fur traders valued pemmican highly because it could be preserved and used for food during their long travels. Over time, the Métis developed their own unique identity. They created Michif, a language that is a mixture of various languages, primarily French and Cree. They followed their own religious beliefs, combining aspects of both Catholicism and First Nation spirituality. Métis clothes were a blend of European and native fashions. The Métis developed dances such as the Red River Jig and songs that reflected their experiences. As the century progressed, Métis communities formed close political bonds. They stood together to resist attacks on their rights and their way of life. So let's wrap up today's lesson by considering these two questions. Number one, do you think the Loyalist settlers felt the same way about the changes in British North America as the First Nations did? And two, how are the Loyalists and the First Nations experiences in adjusting to a new way of life similar? And at the same time, how are their experiences different? So what you're going to do when I finish talking is put the video on pause so you can write down your responses to these two questions. If you don't feel confident in your ability to answer these two questions, it means you need to go back, watch this video at least 2 more times, and then when you're ready, put the video on pause. And as always, I look forward to discussing everybody's responses to these questions as well as the questions posted earlier in this video. But until tomorrow's class, this concludes today's video.